You won't believe the scandals behind these 15 famous black pastors. Some were global superstars, some led massive megachurches, but all of them were hiding stories that shocked everyone when they came out. And the wildest part? The deeper you go into this list, the crazier it gets. So stick around, because this gets unbelievable really fast. 1. Eddie Long. Let's start with one of the most controversial figures in modern black church history, Bishop Eddie Long of New Birth Missionary Baptist Church in Georgia. At his peak, Long led a megachurch with about 25,000 members and was considered one of the most influential pastors in America. But in 2010, everything came crashing down. 4 young men filed lawsuits accusing Long of coercing them into sexual relationships when they were teenagers in his church's youth ministry. These weren't just random accusations. The lawsuits included explicit text messages and detailed accounts of manipulation and abuse. Long initially denied everything and told his congregation he would fight the allegations. But here's where it gets interesting. He settled all the lawsuits out of court for undisclosed amounts. No trial, no public testimony, just sealed settlements. Many people saw this as an admission of guilt, even though Long never publicly admitted wrongdoing. What made this particularly disturbing was Long's history of preaching against homosexuality. He had led a march against same-sex marriage and built his ministry partly on traditional values. The hypocrisy was staggering. He was accused of doing privately what he condemned publicly, and doing it with vulnerable young men who looked up to him as a spiritual father. Long passed away in 2017 from cancer, but the damage to his legacy and to his victims remains. His case became a symbol of how power and secrecy can enable abuse within religious institutions. The young men he allegedly hurt had to carry that trauma, while Long enjoyed wealth, influence, and respect for years before the truth came out. This is why accountability matters, because without it, victims suffer in silence while abusers thrive. 2. Creflo Dollar. Creflo Dollar, yes, that's really his name, is the founder of World Changers Church International in Georgia, another megachurch with thousands of members. Dollar is famous for preaching the prosperity gospel, which basically says that God wants you to be rich and that faith can bring you wealth. Convenient theology when you're asking people for money, right? But Dollar made headlines in 2012 for something much darker than his questionable financial theology. He was arrested and charged with battery after an altercation with his 15-year-old daughter. According to police reports, his daughter called 911, claiming that Dollar choked her, threw her to the ground, and punched her during an argument about attending a party. Dollar denied the allegations, and his daughter later recanted some of her statements. The charges were eventually dropped, but the incident raised serious questions about what happens behind closed doors in the homes of these powerful pastors. His church members largely stood by him, with some appearing at his first service after the arrest to show support. Beyond this incident, Dollar has been criticized for his extravagant lifestyle, which includes luxury cars, multiple homes, and most controversially, a request for his followers to help him buy a $65 million private jet. Yes, you read that right. He asked for donations to purchase a Gulfstream G650 aircraft, claiming it was necessary for his ministry. The audacity is breathtaking. Here's a man preaching to congregations that include struggling families, asking them to fund a lifestyle most people can't even imagine. When confronted about the jet, Dollar defended it, saying commercial flights don't work for his ministry schedule. The mean-spiritedness isn't always about violence. Sometimes it's about the callous exploitation of people's faith and limited resources for personal luxury. 3. T.D. Jakes. Now, T.D. Jakes is one of the most famous pastors in America, leading the Potter's House in Dallas, Texas, with over 30,000 members. He's written books, produced films, and has been generally respected in religious circles. So why is he on this list? In recent years, Jakes has faced serious allegations and controversies that have damaged his reputation. There have been persistent rumors and accusations about his personal life, which intensified when multiple accusers came forward with claims about inappropriate behavior and relationships. What makes Jakes particularly controversial is his response to criticism. Rather than addressing concerns directly and transparently, he's been accused of using his power and influence to silence critics. Several people have claimed they were threatened legally or pushed out of church circles for questioning him. Additionally, Jakes has been criticized for his prosperity gospel teachings and his incredibly lavish lifestyle. While he claims to help the poor, he lives in a multi-million-dollar mansion and flies on private jets. Critics argue there's a disconnect between Jesus' teachings about serving the poor and humble living versus the opulent lifestyle many megachurch pastors embrace. The mean aspect comes through in how Jakes allegedly handles dissent. Former members and employees have described a culture where questioning leadership was not tolerated. Some claim that speaking out against Jakes or his inner circle resulted in public humiliation, being cut off from the church community, or even threats of legal action. When spiritual leaders create environments where people are afraid to speak up, where accountability is seen as an attack, and where questioning is treated as betrayal, that's spiritual abuse. It doesn't matter how many books you've sold or how inspiring your sermons are, if you're using power to intimidate and silence people rather than leading with transparency and humility, there's a problem that needs addressing. 4. Jamal Bryant. Pastor Jamal Bryant of New Birth Missionary Baptist Church, yes, the same church Eddie Long once led, has built a reputation as a charismatic preacher and social justice advocate. But his personal conduct has repeatedly contradicted his public image. Bryant has been involved in multiple scandals related to infidelity and inappropriate relationships. He admitted to having affairs while married, which led to his divorce. But it didn't stop there. Multiple women have come forward over the years with allegations about Bryant's behavior, including accusations of manipulation and inappropriate conduct with church members. What makes Bryant particularly problematic is how he's handled these situations. Rather than showing genuine remorse or stepping back from ministry to work on his character, Bryant has often minimized his actions or blamed others. He's continued to preach about morality and family values while repeatedly violating those same principles. In 2018, social media personality Latasha Kebe, also known as Tasha K, posted audio recordings that allegedly featured Bryant making disrespectful comments about women, including crude sexual references. While Bryant sued her for defamation, the incident added to his pattern of treating women disrespectfully. The mean-spiritedness here is in the hypocrisy and manipulation. Bryant presents himself as a spiritual leader and advocate for the community, particularly for women and families. He preaches sermons about integrity and righteousness. But his actions tell a different story, one of using his position of power to engage in relationships with women in his congregation, betraying his marriage vows repeatedly, and failing to take real accountability. When pastors like Bryant continue to lead churches despite patterns of immoral behavior, it sends a message that charisma and popularity matter more than character. It tells congregants that leaders play by different rules, and that's not just mean, it's spiritually dangerous and damaging to everyone involved. 5. Carlton Pearson. Carlton Pearson's story is different from others on this list, but his mean-spirited treatment of those who disagreed with him and his eventual theological departure caused significant harm to many believers who trusted him. Pearson was once a prominent Pentecostal bishop in Tulsa, Oklahoma, leading Higher Dimensions Church with thousands of members. He was well respected in evangelical circles and had been mentored by Oral Roberts himself. But in the early 2000s, Pearson announced a radical theological shift. He no longer believed in hell. While theological disagreement isn't necessarily mean, what happened next reveals a darker side. Pearson began teaching the gospel of inclusion, which essentially says everyone is already saved and there's no eternal punishment. This contradicted fundamental Christian doctrine he had preached for decades. The mean part? Pearson showed little compassion for the thousands of faithful members who felt betrayed and confused. Many had given their lives to his ministry based on teachings he now said were wrong. Rather than handling this transition with care for his congregation, Pearson was dismissive and condescending toward those who couldn't follow his new theology. His church collapsed from 5,000 members to fewer than 200. Many felt spiritually abandoned and deceived. Former members reported that Pearson was arrogant and uncaring about the damage his sudden theological reversal caused to their faith journeys. Additionally, Pearson was declared a heretic by the Joint College of African American Pentecostal Bishops, a severe action that reflected how far he'd departed from his roots. Rather than showing humility or understanding why this hurt people, Pearson often portrayed himself as a victim of narrow-mindedness. 6. Fred Price. Frederick K.C. Price founded Crenshaw Christian Center in Los Angeles and was one of the pioneering figures in the prosperity gospel movement. He passed away in 2021, but his legacy is complicated by the harmful theology he spread and his sometimes mean-spirited responses to criticism. Price was known for his extravagant lifestyle and unapologetic preaching about wealth. He owned a mansion in Beverly Hills worth millions, drove luxury cars, and wore expensive suits, all while asking his predominantly black congregation, many struggling financially, to give more money to support the vision. But what made Price particularly problematic was his teaching that poverty and sickness were signs of weak faith. He essentially told poor and sick people that their suffering was their own fault, that they weren't believing hard enough or giving enough. This kind of theology is not just wrong, it's cruel. It adds shame to people's suffering and exploits them financially. When criticized, Price could be dismissive and harsh. He famously said he wouldn't pastor a poor church, and that if you're broke, it's your own fault. He showed little compassion for systemic poverty, racism, or economic disadvantage. Instead, he blamed victims and profited from their desperation for change. Price also faced accusations of financial impropriety. Questions were raised about how church funds were used and the lack of financial transparency in his ministry. For a man preaching constantly about money and prosperity, there was surprisingly little accountability about where the money actually went. The meanness in Price's ministry was institutional. It was baked into a theology that exploited vulnerable people's hope for a better life. He took people's last dollars while living in luxury, and when called out, he defended his lifestyle as evidence of God's blessing, rather than acknowledging the problematic power dynamics at play. 7. Lamer Whitehead. Lamer Whitehead, also known as the Bling Bishop, became infamous in 2022, and not for good reasons. Whitehead is the pastor of Leaders of Tomorrow International Ministries in Brooklyn, New York, and he's exactly what you'd expect from someone nicknamed the Bling Bishop: flashy, controversial, and problematic. Whitehead made national headlines when his church was robbed during a live-streamed service. 3 armed robbers entered the church and stole over $1 million in jewelry from Whitehead and his wife. Yes, you read that correctly. They were wearing over $1 million in jewelry while preaching to a congregation in Brooklyn where many families struggle with poverty. But the robbery was just the beginning of Whitehead's problems. In 2024, he was convicted on federal charges, including wire fraud, attempted extortion, and making false statements to federal agents. The evidence showed that Whitehead had defrauded a parishioner out of $90,000 of her retirement savings, promising to help her buy a home, but instead spending the money on luxury goods for himself. Whitehead had also attempted to extort a businessman and lied to FBI agents during the investigation. His behavior showed a pattern of using his position as a pastor to manipulate and steal from vulnerable people who trusted him. What makes Whitehead particularly egregious is his shamelessness. Even while under investigation, he continued to flaunt his wealth on social media, showing off designer clothes, luxury cars, and jewelry. He showed no remorse for the people he'd hurt and seemed to view his ministry primarily as a vehicle for personal enrichment. The mean-spiritedness is in the betrayal, taking an elderly woman's retirement savings, money she'd worked her entire life to save, and spending it on Gucci and Louis Vuitton for himself. That's not just criminal, it's cruel and predatory. And doing it all while claiming to represent God makes it even worse. 8. Zachary Timms. Pastor Zachary Timms founded New Destiny Christian Center in Florida and built it into a megachurch with thousands of members. He was known as a charismatic preacher who connected with young people, but behind the scenes, Timms lived a life that contradicted everything he preached. Timms's personal life was marked by scandal. He admitted to infidelity, which led to his divorce from his wife, who was also a co-pastor. But the adultery was just the beginning. There were also allegations and admissions regarding drug use, which Timms initially denied but later acknowledged he had struggled with. In 2011, Timms was found dead in a New York City hotel room. He was only 42 years old. Police found a small bag of an unidentified white powdery substance in his hotel room. While the official cause of death was later ruled as complications from high blood pressure and an enlarged heart, the circumstances raised many questions about his secret lifestyle. What made Tim's situation particularly problematic was the hypocrisy. He preached about moral living, family values, and spiritual purity while engaging in adultery and substance abuse. He built a ministry on principles he wasn't following himself, deceiving thousands of people who looked to him for spiritual guidance. Additionally, former church members and associates described Timms as temperamental and sometimes verbally abusive when challenged or questioned. He allegedly created an environment where his authority was absolute, and questioning him was tantamount to questioning God. The mean-spiritedness comes from the deception and the impact on his congregation. When Timms died, his church was left in turmoil. Members who had trusted him felt betrayed. His children lost their father under tragic circumstances connected to a lifestyle he'd hidden. His ex-wife, who had tried to sound the alarm about his issues, was vindicated, but at terrible cost. Timms's legacy is a cautionary tale about the danger of elevating leaders without accountability. 9. Bishop Thomas Weeks III. Bishop Thomas Weeks III became nationally known for all the wrong reasons in 2007 when he was arrested for assaulting his ex-wife, televangelist Juanita Bynum, in a hotel parking lot. The attack was brutal. Witnesses reported that Weeks pushed Bynum to the ground, kicked her, and stomped on her. Bynum was a well-known preacher and gospel singer in her own right, which made this domestic violence case even more public. She had to be hospitalized following the attack. Weeks eventually pleaded guilty to aggravated assault and received probation, anger management classes, and a fine. But here's what makes this particularly disturbing. Weeks was a bishop, a spiritual leader who preached about love, family, and Christian values. Yet he violently attacked his wife in a public place. The contrast between his public persona and his private actions couldn't have been starker. What made it worse was how Weeks initially responded. Rather than taking full responsibility, he made statements that seemed to minimize the violence or shift blame. It wasn't until the legal process forced him to admit guilt that he began to show any real accountability. Weeks continued to pastor after the incident, which raised serious questions about consequences and accountability in religious leadership. Here was a man convicted of brutally assaulting a woman, his own wife, yet he maintained his position of spiritual authority over a congregation. The meanness is obvious. Domestic violence is inherently about power, control, and cruelty. But beyond the violence itself, Weeks's ability to continue in ministry afterward sends a dangerous message that leaders can abuse women and face minimal consequences. It tells victims that their safety matters less than maintaining leadership continuity. 10. Pastor Kenneth Adkins. Pastor Kenneth Adkins of Greater Dimensions Christian Fellowship in Brunswick, Georgia, was a prominent anti-LGBTQ activist who frequently spoke out against same-sex relationships and gay rights. He was loud, outspoken, and positioned himself as a moral authority in his community. But in 2017, Adkins was convicted of a serious crime and sentenced to life in prison. According to prosecutors and court records, Adkins harmed 2 teenage girls and a teenage boy between 2013 and 2016. The victims were members of his church, and Adkins used his position of authority to manipulate and abuse them. What made this case particularly shocking was the hypocrisy. Here was a man who constantly preached about sexual morality and condemned others, yet he was harming children in his own congregation. Adkins had even made headlines for his harsh comments about victims of the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando, showing callous disregard for human suffering. During the trial, evidence showed that Adkins had groomed these young people, using his spiritual authority to convince them that his actions were acceptable. The jury heard testimony from multiple victims describing patterns of abuse that occurred in his church office, his home, and during church trips. After his conviction, Adkins continued to maintain his innocence despite the evidence and jury verdict. He's currently serving a life sentence in Georgia State Prison. The case received extensive coverage from local Georgia news outlets and was also reported by CNN and other national media due to the stunning hypocrisy involved. 11. Darrell Gilliard. Darrell Gilliard was once considered a rising star in Baptist ministry. He was mentored by prominent pastors and served at Shiloh Metropolitan Baptist Church in Jacksonville, Florida, where he built a congregation of thousands. But Gilliard's ministry was built on lies and abuse. In 2008, Gilliard was arrested and charged with lewd and lascivious conduct involving 2 young girls, ages 14 and 15, who were members of his congregation. According to police reports and court testimony, Gilliard had engaged in inappropriate sexual contact with these minors, using his authority as their pastor to manipulate them. This wasn't Gilliard's first scandal. Throughout his ministry career, dating back to the 1980s, Gilliard had faced multiple accusations of sexual misconduct with young women and girls. Churches had quietly moved him along rather than reporting his behavior to authorities, a pattern that allowed him to continue victimizing people for decades. In 2009, Gilliard pleaded guilty to lewd and lascivious conduct and was sentenced to 3 years in state prison. He was also required to register as a sex offender. The Florida Times-Union covered the case extensively, documenting how Gilliard had used his charisma and preaching ability to maintain power even as allegations mounted. What makes Gilliard's case particularly disturbing is how the system failed. Multiple churches and leaders knew about allegations against him, but chose to protect their reputations rather than protect children. By the time he was finally held accountable, he had harmed numerous victims over more than 20 years. Former congregation members described feeling betrayed not just by Gilliard, but by the entire system that enabled him. The church leaders who knew and did nothing were complicit in every subsequent act of abuse. 12. Juan Demetrius McFarland. Bishop Juan Demetrius McFarland of Shiloh Missionary Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, was a respected religious leader who served on various community boards and was seen as a pillar of the community. But behind this respectable facade was a man engaged in systematic fraud. In 2018, McFarland was indicted on multiple federal charges, including wire fraud, mail fraud, and bank fraud. According to the federal indictment and FBI investigation, McFarland had orchestrated an elaborate scheme to defraud his congregation and several banks out of hundreds of thousands of dollars. The scheme involved McFarland taking out fraudulent loans, using the church's credit, forging documents, and stealing money from church accounts for personal use. Prosecutors presented evidence that McFarland had stolen over $900,000 from the church and used it to fund a lavish personal lifestyle, including luxury cars, expensive clothing, and vacations. In 2020, McFarland was convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to over 4 years in federal prison. The evidence presented at trial showed a calculated, long-running fraud where McFarland systematically looted church resources while presenting himself as a faithful steward. What made this particularly painful for the congregation was that many members were elderly people on fixed incomes who had sacrificed to give to the church. They believed their money was going toward ministry and community service. Instead, it funded McFarland's personal indulgences. The Montgomery Advertiser and AL.com covered the trial extensively, including testimony from church members who felt betrayed and heartbroken. Some had given their last dollars to building campaigns and special offerings, only to learn their pastor was stealing from them. McFarland showed little remorse during sentencing, which only deepened the hurt for his victims. 13. Henry Lyons. Henry Lyons was known as the deacon among his followers. He was charismatic, God-fearing, and spent most of his free time at the church, counseling his members and raising money for church projects. In 1994, when he became president of the National Baptist Convention USA Incorporated, it seemed like the perfect fit. The NBC is the largest predominantly African-American Christian denomination in the United States with around 10 million members worldwide. But just 4 years later, everything came crashing down. In 1998, federal prosecutors indicted Lyons for fraud, extortion, money laundering, conspiracy, and tax evasion. The charges were serious and the evidence was overwhelming. Lyons initially pleaded innocent and claimed racial prejudice was behind the charges. However, the facts told a different story. In 1999, a court sentenced him to 5.5 years in federal prison for misappropriating more than $4 million from the National Baptist Convention while he was president. Think about that for a moment. $4 million meant for God's work, stolen from the faithful members who trusted their leader. Lyons' fall from grace was complete. The man who once stood before millions as their spiritual leader was now wearing prison clothes and serving time like any other criminal. His case remains one of the most significant examples of corruption in Black church leadership history. 14. Dwight Malachi York. Dwight Malachi York is another pastor whose crimes were so serious that he received essentially a life sentence. York was the leader of the United Nuwaubian Nation of Moors, a religious group based in Georgia. He presented himself as a spiritual leader and teacher, attracting followers who believed in his unique interpretation of religious texts that combined elements of Islam, Christianity, and ancient Egyptian religion. But in the 1990s and early 2000s, authorities began investigating reports of child abuse at York's compound. What they discovered was horrifying. York had been systematically abusing children in his community for years, using his position as a religious leader to manipulate victims and their families. In 2004, York was found guilty of several serious crimes, including hurting children and being involved in illegal money activities. The evidence showed he had abused dozens of children, some as young as 4 years old. Victims testified that York told them the abuse was part of their religious education and that God had commanded it. He also used the organization's finances for personal benefit while his followers lived in poverty. The judge sentenced York to 135 years in federal prison. Like Tony Alamo, this is essentially a life sentence with no realistic possibility of parole. York is currently serving his sentence in a federal prison. His case demonstrates the most extreme abuse of religious authority and the importance of protecting children from predators, even when those predators claim to be spiritual leaders. The harm York caused to his victims and their families is immeasurable and lifelong. 15. James David Manning. Dr. James David Manning is the pastor of Atla Worldwide Missionary Church in Harlem, New York. He became a pastor in the early 1980s after serving time in prison for armed robbery. Manning later changed the church's name from Bethelite to Atla, which stands for All the Land Anointed Holy. His church runs a children's breakfast program and functions as a private Christian school. Manning became nationally known for his controversial and often offensive statements, particularly about LGBTQ people and President Barack Obama. His church displayed signs with messages like, "Jesus would stone homos, and Obama has released the homo demons on the black man." These extreme views made him one of the most controversial black pastors in America. But Manning's legal troubles weren't related to his offensive speech. They were about money. He and his church failed to pay their bills and taxes for years. The city of New York eventually moved to foreclose on the church property. Manning argued that he shouldn't have to pay taxes, claiming some form of religious exemption. However, the courts didn't agree with his reasoning. In 2016, the church faced a public auction. Just 6 days before the scheduled auction, Manning's legal team obtained a temporary restraining order that pushed back the sale. The case dragged on for years. Interestingly, an LGBTQ organization tried to buy the church property with plans to turn it into a homeless shelter, which many saw as poetic justice, given Manning's history of anti-LGBTQ rhetoric. While Manning avoided prison, his case shows that religious leaders must follow the same laws as everyone else, including paying taxes. Let me know which story shocked you the most in the comments. And don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you never miss another breakdown like this.